Good afternoon, and welcome to the September Speaking of Art. It looks like we've got too many events going on, and we're a little light crowd, so clap loudly and be appreciative because you're in for a real treat here. We are honored to have David Martin speak to us today. As anyone who has been paying any attention at all to Northwest art history in the past decades is aware, David has been indefatigable in bringing to our attention people, unknown people or little known people in Northwest art history, and he has broadened our idea of what the tradition of Northwest history is and the people who should rightfully be included there. It would not be an exaggeration to call him a one-man justice squad, bringing well-deserved attention to many admirable artists who were slighted by the societal short-sightedness of their own times. Today he focuses on women artists who created in many mediums during the 20th century, but have often been overlooked. I want to thank Susan Platt, a longtime friend of David's, with arranging this talk. Unfortunately, she had to fly to the East Coast to deliver a talk of her own today, so she doesn't get the pleasure of hearing this firsthand. But we do get the generous expansion of our understanding that David brings us today. So please, let's have that pleasure and welcome David Martin.
Thank you very much. I did not write that introduction, and I realized this morning that I'm glad that you people showed up, because I know there's something going on in a few hours that I thought no one would come to my talk because you want to see what's going on with the debate. So thanks for coming. Thanks for the introduction. I want to plug the museum that I work for. I work for Cascadia Art Museum. I'm the curator there. It's in Edmonds, and I hope you've all been there. And if you haven't, please come to see some of our exhibitions. And we promote, it's strictly Northwest art that we do it. That's all it is. It's strictly Northwest and strictly historical Northwest art from 1870 up until 1970. And so since I take it you're all art lovers here pretty much, right? Are you Northwest art lovers too? Okay, so we're going to make this interactive because I don't want you to fall asleep on me, so I'm going to be asking you questions too. So how many of you have ever heard of Dale Chihuly? How many of you have ever heard of Morris Graves? How many of you have heard of Mark Toby? Okay, we're not talking about them today. How many of you have ever heard of Louise Crowe? How many of you have ever heard of Yvonne Twining Humber? How many of you have heard of Harriet Foster Beecher? Do you see why I need to do talks like this? All of the women, I'm gonna introduce you to some of these women. And when I started doing this work in 1986, I was shocked at how many artists were active here, were nationally and internationally known, and yet they had been swept under the rug. And it wasn't just women, it was minority artists as well, primarily Japanese and Chinese American artists. These were the artists that put this area on the map, the Northwest on the map, nationally and internationally, and yet they were all forgotten, and up until 1986, and they still are forgotten, unfortunately. So that's why Cascadia exists, to remedy that. And I've just finished my 17th book on that I work with the University of Washington Press, and we're trying to establish the real art history of Washington State. And rather than focusing only on a few of the guys, we're making it inclusive because, as you'll see, a lot of these women certainly deserve it. So along the line, here's some of the artists I told you about. Here's some photos of them. The upper left is Myra Wiggins. Lower left is Yvonne Twining Humber. Center is Dorothy Dolph Jensen. Bottom right, Louise Crowe. And upper right, Elizabeth Warhanek and I need to put my glasses on, sorry. And Dorothy Dolph Jensen. So let's start this, and I'll introduce you to some of these artists. So this artist is Myra Albert Wiggins. And Myra Wiggins was the very first internationally known artist from the Northwest. She was primarily a photographer. She studied painting at the Art Students League in the 19th century, but met Alfred Stieglitz. Do you know who Alfred Stieglitz was, the photographer? She became very close friends with him at the turn of the century in New York and got involved with photography as well as painting. And she became part of the New York Camera Club and was part of Alfred Stieglitz's early exhibitions, pictorial photography exhibitions, and won quite a few awards on the East Coast. But she was actually from up here. She was from Salem, Oregon originally, and then moved to Toppenish, Washington, and then finally to Seattle, where she was one of the first people who moved into the Loveless building, building on 10th Avenue East in Harvard. So, why am I talking to you about her? She's one of the really great early artists here. Now, when I moved here in 1986, I started researching because I already knew about some of these artists, having grown up on the East Coast, and they were well known back there, but no one knew who they were here. And so I had this pat answer from almost all the museums, libraries, and everything, and I started inquiring about women artists of the Northwest. Every single place told me the exact same thing. They were a bunch of nice old ladies who painted flowers. And everybody told me that. I'm not kidding you. The Seattle Art Museum, the library, all of the other museums, except for one guy who was a friend of mine, who became a friend of mine, named Jervis Reed, who was a teacher at the University of Washington. And he became my mentor, along with a woman named Lamar Harrington, who was one of the great curators at the unfortunately now deceased Bellevue Art Museum. So I did learn from a lot of my elder mentors, and then I just carried it and just sort of continued to do my own research and uncovered so much art that has been buried that I can keep going for another 50 years and not cover it all. So, okay. What I found was these nice old ladies who painted flowers were the region's first, formed the region's first art groups. The first arts organization in Seattle was the Society of Seattle Artists, which was established in 1904, and the Fine Arts Society, founded in 1906, and that eventually became the Seattle Art Museum in 1933. By 1928, the Northwest Printmakers Society had formed, and 10 of the 12 charter members were women. So all of those early arts organizations were formed by women and women artists. Here's Harriet Foster Beecher. She opened the first professional art studio in Seattle in 1881. She was an art instructor at the University of Washington from 1882 to 1883, and it was called the Territorial University back then. Her work was exhibited at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, and she was a charter member of the Society of Seattle Artists. Now, why were these World's Fairs important? Because we didn't have a museum. So if you were anyone who was prominent in the region, you showed at big venues such as World's Fairs, and then that's how you represented your region. So here's Myra Wiggins that I was just talking about. And as I mentioned, she was a painter, but we're going to just look at her photography today. She was born in 1869, died in 1956, and the photo that you see on your left is called The Forge from 1897. That's a very unusual photograph for anyone to take at the time to show some kind of an industrial subject matter, but it's also extremely unusual for a woman to make a photo like that, because if you can think of what women were just wearing clothes-wise in 1897, you know that it was a very restrictive type of clothing that they had to put up with. So it was very unusual for a woman to be in an industrial situation like that. That photograph became so well known that George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak, company, he gave her a prize for it, which included cameras and a trip to Paris to photograph in Paris. And he asked her to make an enlargement of it, and it stayed in his office in Rochester, New York, until he died. The other aspect of which she became very well known for was her what they called Dutch genre scenes, and that was from Alfred Stieglitz saying that she was a Dutch genre. What does that photo remind you of? Vermeer, right? So this is the time when they were trying to make photography an art form, so she's looking at old masters, artists like Vermeer, and trying to reproduce it in photography. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the woman standing is her cousin, the little girl was her daughter, and this is called Homesickness, and this was exhibited all over the world, this photographic print. Now, it looks like a little Dutch interior scene. What it is the inside of her house in Toppenish, Washington. She built like an armature and stretched old muslin fabric and dyed it with teas and coffees and different things like that to make it look like old plaster. She built it herself. That's her front door that they're looking out of. And she studied old master paintings and made the clothing by looking at old master paintings. In 1910, Stieglitz produced what was the sort of apotheosis of artistic photography in the United States, and he included a group that he called that Myra Wiggins was a member of. It was sort of the culmination of arts. Now, she was the art photography. And she was the only person from Washington State included in this. And you can see there's two more. This was at the Albright Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York, my hometown. And you can see, again, if you look in the center, that's her daughter, once again, that she's using as a model. She made all the clothes. And then these three images were exhibited in the Stieglitz exhibition, probably the most important photography exhibition of the 20th century. Now look in the center, you see that's her initials, MAW. So she's combining the influences of contemporary art, Japanese art, right? It looks like a Japanese signature or a cipher, and then the Dutch. So that's one of the things that I've always loved about Northwest art is the synthesis that we have of different cultures that ends up producing this sort of hybrid work in our regional art. These three works were purchased I used to have an art gallery. I opened it in the 1980s, and a woman came into my gallery once, and I was doing a show of these works, and she purchased all three of these prints from the family through my gallery, and her name was Wilhelmina Cole Holliday. And she went by Billy, and we became friends. She was the founder of the Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. So she became a very good friend of mine, and she purchased a number of works by women artists from my old gallery, and then I became the state representative for that museum. I was the only man that was a representative of the museum back in the 90s. I did that for 3 years. So I'm showing you the people who were really became well known very early on. This is Louise Crowe, and that's a photo of her up there on your upper right. And Louise Crowe was part of the Moran family. Some of you might have heard of the Morans. They were the shipbuilding family. They were very prominent and very wealthy. And her mother was one of the Moran children. She was her mother was the sister of Robert Moran and the people that formed, I forgot what it's called on Orcas Island, the Rosario Resort. So she was very prominent. Now, in 1913, she went to Carmel to study with an artist named William Merritt Chase. It was the only time that he taught on the West Coast. And it was a summer class, and he invited, artists who were already pretty well known, to join his class. So it was over 1,000 people that showed up for that summer to study with William Merritt Chase. These are very rare photos of Chase painting. The upper two, those are from Louise's scrapbooks, and those are very, very rare photographs of him painting at Carmel. And at the end of the summer, he rewarded two of the best painters, one female and one male artist, as the best in the class. Out of over 1,000 people, guess what? They were both from Seattle. It was Louise Crowe and an artist named John Butler, John Davidson Butler, who you really haven't heard of, but that's for another talk. And then the painting that you see, a painting of eucalyptus trees, that's a painting that I was able to locate that gives you an idea of the type of impressionism that she was, impressionistic works that she was doing at the time. She also went down to Santa Fe in 1915. She had a respiratory problem, and she went down to study and paint and to work in Santa Fe. She met Robert Henry there and several other artists, and became one of the first artists working in abstraction in the Northwest, because she went back and forth. One of her best friends was Marsden Hartley, the painter Marsden Hartley, who promoted her work all over the country. And actually, he said that Louise Crowe was the young artist that all young artists should look up to and emulate. Now, I found this again to illustrate the type of works or the type of behavior that women had to put up with at the time. So I have this little excerpt from 1918 from El Palacio. It was the art publication in Santa Fe at the time. And it says, Miss Crowe, who studied under Chase and other masters, surprised even her friends with the fine quality of her exhibit. Her portraits have a strength and a simplicity that are masculine, and which one finds only in such masters as Whistler, of whom at least two of her portraits are reminders. Although unlike most other women artists, there is nothing of imitation or lack of originality in any of her work. So that was lovely. How's that for a compliment to your exhibition? Backsided compliment, I would say. Well, during the time she's in Santa Fe, she starts meeting prominent Native Americans in the San Ildefonso community there, and she produces these incredible portraits of some of the leaders of the community. This one of, I think his name was Yancy Do, dates from about 1918. We actually borrowed this painting from the museum in Santa Fe a few years ago to show it in Seattle for the very first time, and it had not been shown since the 1930s. And so they took it out of storage for us, and they let us borrow it for a year. One of her great accomplishments was portraiture, and this is a good example of her self-portrait. Now, again, she's doing all this work, receiving accolades from all over the world, but she's getting some, sort of not so much support in Seattle. So I found this wonderful newspaper thing, a little clipping, and I'm just going to read it to you real quickly. Among the prominent Seattle artists rejected from the exhibition this year, that was the Northwest Annuals that were held starting in 1914, Miss Louise Crowe, Edgar Faulkner, who won first prize in the 1927 show, and lists the other artists. Said Miss Crowe this morning, Mark Tobey admits that he was rejected in Paris and New York at different exhibitions. I have not been rejected in those cities. I was admitted to the Autumn Salon in Paris and the Ainsley Gallery in New York. Washington, Oakland, and San Francisco shows are open to me. It remained for Mr. Tobey to reject me. My painting is objective. I consider subjectivity the refuge of artists who don't know how to draw. Anyway, I had to put that in there because here she was, this great, great artist who was receiving international exhibition, and Mark Tobey was on the jury, and he had no recognition outside of very little exhibitions here in the Northwest, and he rejected her painting for the Northwest Annual, so she got her little jab right back at him. This is her masterpiece. It's called Eagle Dance. It's from 1919, and this painting is 6 by 8 feet tall. And this was one of the series of paintings of Native Americans of the San Ildefonso tribe that were exhibited all over the world. And this painting is the very first painting by a Seattle artist to be exhibited internationally at the Autumn Salon in Paris in 1921, but it was painted in 1919. You can see how modern it is. Now today, some people, this is on permanent display at our museum, and some people say, wow, this is really nice, and they think it was just painted. And for it to be painted in 1919, it's pretty much ahead of its time. You can see that she's using 3 different perspective levels, okay? You're looking at a worm's eye view of looking up at the plaza. You're looking straight ahead at the drummers, the 4 men in the background, and then you're looking down on the eagle dancers. So she's synthesizing all of these different angles. It's kind of what Picasso was doing, but in a more realistic manner. Now, the reason why you don't know a lot of these artists is because a lot of the work was lost or hidden away in family collections. When I discovered this painting, that's me, don't make fun. I discovered this painting right before it was going to be thrown in a dumpster. And here it is, that's me with it, and I was starting to clean it. You can see if you look in the upper right above my head, all that black area was what it looked like. And the whole right portion of it detached of the painting, and the people that had it, it was, the kids drew all over it with crayons and everything. So I rescued it from being thrown in the dumpster, and it's a masterwork that's been already exhibited nationally and internationally. Here's another, the Northwest Printmakers Society. 10 of the 12 founders were women artists. This is a print from the late 1920s by Ruth Pennington, who used to live here. She was a professor at the University of Washington, a great friend of mine, and a really, really great printmaker and painter, and she became well known for her silversmithing. The Northwest Printmakers became so well known, it started out in 28. By the 1930s, it was so well known internationally that Picasso and George Braque exhibited with them here in Seattle. This is Elizabeth Colborn, an artist that I rediscovered quite a while ago, and I wrote a book about her. And she was from Bellingham, but was also one of the very first artists to have representation in New York City. She became known for her very detailed studies of trees in crayon, that's the upper right, and most famous for her colored block prints of the Northwest, where she's taking Northwest subjects and treating them like a Japanese print, and using local subjects and using multi-block carvings to produce these prints. When I discovered her work about, I don't even remember, 1988 or 89, I finally was able to write a book about her, and the book went out of print in 6 months. And good luck trying to find a copy, and I was very stupid and only kept 2 copies for myself, and it's selling for like $400 and $500 now. So people like her work all over. Now, in 1930, Women Painters of Washington was formed in Seattle. And why did they form in 1930? 1929, there was another group that started called the Puget Sound Group of Northwest Men Painters. That was, it's not called that anymore, it's just called the Puget Sound Group. But they excluded women, and I knew some of the people that started it and were early members, and they said that they didn't want any women involved in it because it wasn't a matter of that not knowing how to paint, it's just that they wanted to get away from their wives. That's what I was told, so it's kind of horrible, but that was the case. So the women, who actually had more reputation at the time, formed their own group. And it was originally called Women Artists of Washington, then it changed to Women Painters of Washington in 1936, and it's still going today. These are the founders of the organization, and one of them is Elizabeth Warhanick. Warhanik, that's her in Japan in 1907, right before she moved here and became a very well-known painter. She starts off doing work in a sort of a post-impressionism manner. That's a beautiful oil painting of Fremont from probably about 1915 or so. And she was a very innovative artist. She also did block printing. This is called the Provincetown type of print. And this is I did a book on color printmaking in Washington State, and I used the cover called it's Territorial Hues. I used the cover because it's so beautiful and it's so Northwest, and I thought it perfectly represented the region. She also was one of the early abstract artists here. So this is the image that you see on the right is a Provincetown print again from the 1920s, and a sort of fractured planar abstraction from the probably this was painted around, it's not dated, but probably in the early 30s. Now, Elizabeth Warhanik came from have any of you ever heard of her? Yeah, she was like a very big deal here, starting in the teens actually, up until her death in 1968. But she came from a very, very prominent artistic family. Her cousin was N.C. Wyeth, the illustrator, and his son, Andrew Wyeth. And her sister was also an artist, also a painter and illustrator. And you know her work, but you probably don't know her name at all, right? I'm blanking on what her name was right now, but you're going to see why. You're very familiar with her work. And you know why? She was the illustrator for the Dick and Jane series. And what was her name here? Sorry. Eleanor Campbell. Yeah. And she was from here as well, but she moved around a lot because of her great success with illustration. But she died here in her later years. She came and lived with her nieces. So again, back then, the women painters of Washington, the women artists here, were really covered in the newspaper quite a bit. When I was going through doing my book on them, I saw they were like people were proud of them and their accomplishments, and I found numerous clippings and newspaper articles about them, and several of them studied in France, some of the artists, and so they decided to promote the arts. Remember, there's no Seattle Art Museum yet, right? So a lot of them got together and put on exhibitions downtown. This is in front of the library on Madison and 4th. And they wanted to make it like the way you would see the work displayed in Paris on the left bank. So you can see French influence invade Seattle. And these are some of the artists who were prominent here at the time. And you can see that they said putting Seattle on the map. So these are all really great women who promoted the arts. And one of the things I really liked about the women artists from the region is that not only did they promote themselves, but they promoted each other. And they were always trying to lift each other up. And, if one of them had success, like Vanessa Helder, the woman on the far right, if she had success in New York, then she made sure that New York knew about some of her friends and artists. So she arranged the first exhibition of women painters of Washington in 1936 in New York City. It's the first time a group of painters was recognized in New York City at a museum. There's a kind of a fun little photograph there at the bottom I just wanted to show you because the hats are so great. And that's them doing their sort of fake left bank exhibitions on, downtown Seattle. Now notice that's Vanessa Helder, that if you look on the right, she's the tallest woman. Right next to her is a woman that's Dorothy Dolph Jensen, and she's wearing a big sort of picture hat, and if you notice, she's holding on to both of the women flanking her. And I received this photograph from the artist's daughter, who became a good friend of mine, and she gave me this photograph, and I said, "Your mom looks like she's going to pass out," and that they're holding her up. And she said that her mother did pass out a lot. She had some kind of a disorder where she would faint a lot, and they found out later it was because she was wearing corsets. And it was restricting her airflow, and so she would pass out literally. So there she is with her girlfriends, fellow artists, propping her up for the photo. But she was a great painter. She came from a wealthy family in Oregon, originally Forest Grove, and like a lot of wealthy children at the time, the parents sent her and her sister to Europe to be educated, and she ended up going to Brussels. And when they saw that she was very talented artistically, they sent her to Paris. And so she was 12 and 13 years old at the time. When she was in Paris, she showed an aptitude for etching, and she became a very fine etcher at the age of 13. And so this is a photograph of her taken by Edward Curtis, the famous photographer of Native Americans, and one of her great paintings there on your right. She specialized in landscape paintings, and so they're quite beautiful. They're very much influenced by the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. And this is a large work that is hanging in the governor's mansion. And there's the etching press. She was one of the only artists who knew how to etch here in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s. And she not only taught her fellow artists to etch, but she purchased the etching press from Paris and brought it here. It was the first etching press. But she didn't just teach men. I see in your some of your collection in the hall that you have works by James Washington Jr., the sculptor. She actually taught him printmaking and gave him all of the tools and instructed him on how to make block prints. And he used her materials and her press in the early part of his career. Now, these women really know what it was like to be sort of shunned, from the mainstream. And they really helped out a lot of artists like James Washington Jr., who was black. And they would really help elevate the artists who were of different, nationalities, and arrange for them to have shows. They arranged for James Washington's first exhibition at Frederick and Nelson's department store. You remember that? The big department store? That was a gallery, and it was called the Little Gallery. It started in the 30s, and one of the women painters of Washington ran the gallery, and she gave him and an artist named Leo Kenny, you might be familiar with him, they would help promote these artists, especially the artists who weren't able to show at the Seattle Art Museum at the time. This is Peter and Margaret Camperman. Have you ever heard of them? These people, these artists they were husband and wife. They moved here from, I think it was from Minnesota, in 1915 after their marriage. Peter was from The Hague, so he was Dutch, and Margaret was quite a bit older than him, I believe 11 years older or something. But they came out and settled at Langley on Whidbey Island and started an arts colony. Margaret's aunt owned property there, and she invited them and told them if Peter would build a house for her, they could have a tract of land, and that's what he did starting in 1915. And that's Peter in the center at Langley, and these are some of the prominent women artists of the time surrounding him. And I love this because most of them had already had great big reputations by this time, and they were just trying to be open-minded to abstraction and more modern ideas that Peter was promoting. And I just think it's really fun that they're trying to elevate this man when a lot of them could have probably taught him a few things. But I just love this photo, and they were quite a great set of artists here. Peter was one of the earliest abstract artists who Mark Tobey emulated, and instead of using the word copy, I'm using the word emulated. When he came to town, they were the first artists that he was introduced to. And I love this quote that I found in this publication called The Town Crier, which was the Seattle's biggest arts publication at the turn of the century. And this is a photo of the Campermans. And this is Gwendolyn Karkik Pleshev. She would go to Paris and review art exhibitions for the Town Crier magazine in Seattle, so people here would know. This was back in the 20s primarily, the teens, 20s, and then very early 30s. So people would know what was going on in the art world, and they were showing there, the Camphormans. They both studied there, and her quote is, "I really have discovered that the new work at our fine arts," that means the local art exhibitions, "is not at all local. Those two, Peter and Margaret Camphorman, are up to anything here." So they were already building a reputation in Paris. Here's some examples. Here's two nice photographs of Margaret, early photographs of her, and one of her abstract still lifes. And I'm happy, it's unfortunate the way I received it, but I just received the entire archive of the Camphormans, so I'm going to be writing a book about them. So come and see the show, and I'm able to do that. There was an arts organization called the Group of 12, and Margaret was one of the few women who were invited to join it. And that's a beautiful painting of Eastern Washington, the Columbia River, that is now owned by the Tacoma Art Museum. I located this, and we didn't have a museum at the time, so I wanted it to get into a museum, so I recommended that the owner donated, and they did. So again, here's first national exhibition of American art in New York City, and there's Margaret included in the exhibition for her painting called Regal Lilies. Now, as I mentioned before, the women started most of the arts organizations here, including the Northwest Watercolor Society, that formed in 1940 by Vara Grube, who's the one with the funny hat up in the upper left, Dorothy Milne Rising, who's down on the bottom closest to me, and oops, I forgot her name. sorry, her name went out of my head. I'll remember though. Anyway, these were the three women who started the Northwest Watercolor Society, and a lot of the other artists that you're going to see exhibit. Her name was Florence Nesbitt. Sorry. When the Seattle Art Museum opened in 1933, they gave two awards: Best Watercolor, Best Oil Painting, and the Best Oil Painting was won by Morris Graves. Best Watercolor was won by Florence. Here's Vanessa Helder, who is actually the subject of the exhibition that I'm have going right now at Cascadia Art Museum. She was from Bellingham originally, well, Linden, and then Bellingham originally, and went to the University of Washington. She became very well known in New York and all over the country. She was exhibiting at the Museum of Modern Art in the Metropolitan before Toby and Graves. And when she was assigned, you know what the WPA was, right, during the Depression? There was the Spokane Arts Center. It was a teaching center. And she was brought there to teach watercolor and lithography. And while she was there, the Grand Coulee Dam was under construction. And so she did a whole series of watercolors based on the Grand Coulee Dam construction and the environment around it. I did not know her, but I knew her brother, and I knew her best friend, who actually painted with her sometimes. And he told me that it was so hot there where the dam was in summer when she was painting these, because everything was painted on site. These were not done in a studio. He said that she would crawl under her car if it got too hot, and she would run up and down to look at the image, and then go back under the car and paint. So that's, I guess that's determination, but these are incredible works, and if you have time to get up to Edmonds to see this, it's the first time the whole collection's been shown in its entirety. And several of these works were exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in a show called American Realists and Magic Realists. I believe she had 12 paintings included. And the other artists that she shared the walls with were Edward Hopper, Georgia O'Keeffe, and some of the major artists of the time. Unfortunately, she became forgotten. She died in 1968. And she had a bad ending, unfortunately. She had this great career, but she had an alcohol problem. She had bipolar disorder, and she drank herself to death a week after her husband died. So it's a very sad story, and the work was all given to the Jewish Community Center in Westside Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles. She left everything to them, and we don't know why, because she was not Jewish, and neither was her husband. And unfortunately, after her death in '68, they sold all of her artwork, all of her paintings off at tag sales. So most of them were lost. So here's 3 portraits. She not only excelled in watercolor, but she did really great portraits of her artist friends as well. So these are paintings. All 3 of these are on display right now in our exhibition. Now this is our next exhibition, and another artist that has been completely wiped out of the art history here, named B.L. Hyde. Her name was Beulah Loomis Hyde. That's a self-portrait, and that's the cover of my new book with the University of Washington Press. And her work, she starts off, some of you might relate to this, she starts off in 1902 producing really beautiful watercolors and winning awards, and is set for a career, but then she gets married and starts having children, and she had 3 children 2 years apart. So she had to, I think 1914 was the first boy. She had 3 boys. And so she had to put her career on hold to raise her sons. And then she starts working. She wants to get back into it. She's more interested in modernism. So she and another female artist from Tacoma hired Mark Toby to come and work in their studio with them, and they paid him a little, like a stipend, and her entire work starts changing into more of a modernism. It doesn't really look like Toby's work at all, but he's expressing different ideas to her and the other artists that they worked with personally. And these are some of the works. She mostly concentrated on images of factories and industrial scenes, but by paring everything down, I called the exhibition Structure and Form, because that's what she's interested. She's not interested in realism, just using the realism that she's observing and concentrating on the structure and form. So I like both of these. These are 2 of my favorites that are in the book and will be in the exhibition, where she's using these components of factories as still life. So it's set up like a still life, but using these industrial components, and then this beautiful work depicting a lumber yard in Tacoma. And these are some of her abstract landscapes and industrial landscapes from the 1930s up through the 50s. She did the same with still life. She actually showed the same interest to fruit and vegetables and whatever she was painting in still life, and you can see the still life there of the sliced melons, how she's looking at the geometry, kind of like what Cezanne was doing at the time. But this looks very contemporary to me. This looks like something that Wayne Thiebaud would have painted back in past in the 60s, except this is from about 1940. So she really was following her own intuition as an artist and her own way of looking at things. She focused on these industrial subjects. She painted architectural subjects, several of barns, and did quite a few self-portraits that are the most unflattering things you've ever seen. You can see this painting that I'm thinking she might have liked Edvard Munch, who did the Scream. It looks very Munchish to me. So all of her I've seen about a dozen of her self-portraits, and they're all very unflattering and very intense. Almost like she almost looks totemic to me in this one. And here's another work, another self-portrait of her, and again probably from about 1935 or 36, and one of her early industrial scenes that when I first saw it I thought of surrealism. And I think that if any of you know the work of Giorgio de Chirico, He was a famous surrealist painter at the in Italy at the time, and I think she was influenced by him, because here she's showing this industrial subject, and it's almost like a dream type of image. It does not look real at all, but again, it's concentrating on form. So Ebba Rapp is another artist who I didn't meet her, but I got to meet her husband when they first moved here in 1986. She had just died. And that is also a portrait of Ebba taken by Edward Curtis, the famous photographer of Seattle, of the Northwest Native Americans. And she was a painter and a sculptor. She studied at Cornish primarily, and then she studied with Alexander Archipenko at the University of Washington in the mid-30s, along with her close friend George Tsutakawa. So they were both students of Archipenko, and that's when both of them really started their career in sculpture. And that's an example. That sculpture there by her is about 4 feet tall. It's terracotta and shows this modernist type of approach as filtered through Archipenko. She was so impressed. The community was so impressed with her work that Nellie Cornish, who founded the Cornish Museum or Cornish School, hired her to start the sculpture department. So she started the first sculpture department at Cornish in 1935. But she was also a painter and a block printer. That's a portrait that she painted of Nellie Cornish up there, and one of her sort of semi-surrealist paintings of it's called the start of spring or something like that. But you can see the sprouting potatoes. This painting was given to me by her husband, and I really loved it. And he said, "What does this remind you of?" And I said, "Well, they're a little scary, the spring." He said, "Look at the green background," and I'm looking, and then I caught on. It's about fertility, and that's a phallus that she was forming with the fabric to show fertility in spring. Now, when she was there at Cornish, when Ebba was there at Cornish, she had very close friends that were in other departments and who posed for her paintings. One of her close friends was Merce Cunningham, the dancer. You know who he was, huh? He posed for this painting called The Brooding Boy. That was exhibited in 1939 at the Seattle Art Museum, and there's a photo of him from several years later. But Merce was a model for several of her paintings, as was Sevilla Fort. Now, Sevilla Fort, here's another example of women. Have any of you heard of her, of Sevilla Fort? You've heard of Merce Cunningham, though, right? Okay, so here's another thing that we need to work on. So Sevilla Fort was the first black art student at Cornish, and she was a very talented dancer and choreographer. And in, I think it was 1934 or 35, she was commissioned by Nellie Cornish and by the school to create a dance based on her African heritage. So she was her African American heritage, I should say. And so she was commissioned to do this. Now, Cornish at the time, it's the old building that just was sold, unfortunately, on Capitol Hill. She would pose for Ebba. So you see, Ebba did several portraits of her. That's the painting of Sevilla that's done from around 1939. And Sevilla was working on this project of this choreography project at Cornish, and because it was so small at the time, there wasn't enough room for an orchestra or even a small group of musicians. So one of the other artists who was there at the time in the music department was John Cage. And John Cage was a friend. These were all these were all friends, close friends with each other. And so John Cage had to come up with something percussive. So the choreography was very rhythmic, and he had to do it with one instrument, which was the piano. And he invented the prepared piano, which is very famous now, for this artist, for Sevilla Fort. to perform it at Cornish in the mid-1930s. And I did track down the original sheet music, which is in New York, in the New York Public Library. Here's a later shot of Eva there in her studio, and you can see the different styles. She's older in this photograph, but she was, this is a nice photo that her husband took of her towards the end of her life. Now, Peggy Strong was another artist from Tacoma, a friend of the artist that I just talked about, B.L. Hyde. And Peggy Strong also came from a very wealthy family in Lakewood, and showed prominent, prominence in the arts from an early age. And in 1932, I think it was, 32 or 33, she was heading to Paris. She won a scholarship to study in Paris. And on the way there to drive to New York City with her boyfriend, the car tire blew out, and I think they were in Wyoming, and it tumbled down the side of an embankment and severed her spine. So she was in the hospital for, I think, 2 years or something like that. Her sister, some of you might know Gene Walkinshaw or know of Gene Walkinshaw, the local film producer and brilliant movie and documentary producer, who's a close friend of mine. She was Peggy's sister. She is Peggy's sister. Now, the self-portrait by Peggy there, where she's bound and gagged, this is a self-portrait done towards the end of her life when she was realizing she was going to die and never have a family or children or anything. I think it's one of the most moving portraits I've ever seen. But this is typical of her work, and there she is with her father, who was an engineer, and you can see she's sitting in a wheelchair. And this woman had so much determination that she wasn't going to let anything stop her. Her sister told me she was paralyzed from the chest down, but she could use her arms, but she couldn't walk or anything. But she wasn't going to let it get to her either, and so her father built her a platform that she could do her paintings, and I'm going to show you a picture of it. But he also set up a system in her car where she could brake and drive just with her hands and her forearms. So she drove twice cross-country, paralyzed, on her own to do commissions on the East Coast. And here she is. She did several murals during the Depression, and if you take a look, you can see in the photo in the upper left, her father made this platform for her so she could just grab the metal chains there, if you can see them, and lower herself or move herself up and down so she could do these very large murals. And that's in the Wenatchee, well, it was the Wenatchee Post Office. It's closed, but it's now the Wenatchee Historical Society. But she was a really incredible artist and really deserves to be remembered. We did the first exhibition, solo exhibition in modern times at our museum a couple years ago. So towards the end of her life, she went to live with her sister in San Francisco, and her sister was close friends with Dr. Howard Thurman there on the left. Do you know who he was? Dr. Thurman was the mentor to Martin Luther King. He traveled to India in the 1930s as a minister and a Christian minister, and learned all about what is Martin Luther King? He worked with Gandhi and learned about pacifism and passive resistance. Thank you there. So Martin Luther King's mentor was this man, Dr. Howard Thurman, and he and Peggy became very, very close friends. He wanted to be a painter, and so he was also a musician, besides being a minister and a civil rights activist. He taught her how to play the recorder, and she taught him how to paint. And they had this very close friendship until she passed away. But her later works are very, very moving. She's often depicted as there she is in red, there with the man that she was engaged to that left her because of her accident. And you can see she's all hollowed out, and she's just sort of a shell, and he's looking away from her. And then this memory, because she was a horsewoman, did horse riding and things like that before her accident, and she's showing these men that sort of look like little clusters of with their stovepipe hats and everything. So her later paintings are very disturbing before she passes away. Another part of this group was Blanche Morgan Losey. This is a portrait of her by Vanessa Helder. What was interesting is, oops, sorry, it went the wrong way. Where does she go? Oh, it's not. Let's go this way. I'm almost finished here. So here's Blanche Morgan Losey. She met Vanessa Helder when they were both studying at the University of Washington in the 1930s. And they were both studying architecture at the time, but their professor, Lionel Pries, told them that they were wasting their time because no one would ever hire a female architect. So he discouraged them from becoming architects and studying further, but they did learn how to make these very incredible realistic renderings, architectural renderings, and they used it in their fine art. So these are two works by Blanche Morgan Losey. The top one's owned by the Seattle Art Museum. It was purchased by Dr. Fuller. And the other one is in a private collection. It's called Bombardier's View, done during World War II. But she also, here's a photo of them, all of these artists, and I'm talking about at the Oddfellows Temple, which is where they had their studios up on Capitol Hill. And so Blanche went from this type of realism, which is inspired by architectural renderings, to surrealism. And I knew her husband, and I did meet one of her friends. And I said to her once, I said, why did Blanche, go from being this, painter of architecture and scenes of Seattle into these works of surrealism? And she didn't miss a beat. She said, because she got married to Luther. So nobody liked her husband, apparently. But you can see these, this is a disaggregation. She painted her and her husband falling apart as a sculptor, as a piece of sculpture. And then she depicted herself in the lower right painting of herself dressed as a 19th century woman with hats that she made. She was, whatever that's called, a milliner, and designed and made her own clothes. So she's depicting herself in this very precarious position on a train track. She's about to be mowed over by a train for her 19th century aesthetic. She was, during the Depression, she had to find, most of these people, if they didn't come from wealthy families, had to find ways of making money. And Blanche's way, besides being a painter, she designed stage sets and clothing for the federal theater projects. That was a theater project, part of the WPA under Roosevelt's New Deal. And here's a photo of her. You can see she's with a very famous friend in the upper left, Eleanor Roosevelt, and some of the stage sets that she developed for the theater company. Now, one of the groups that she was assigned to was called the Negro Repertory Company. It was one of the only all-black groups, theatrical groups in the United States. And they started making a splash nationally because several of the artists, the actors in the group, would not play certain roles. The women would not play mammies or maids, and the men would only play roles that were caricatures of men. So that caught the attention of quite a few people around the country, and they became very, very famous at the time. So this image that you see on the left, bottom left, is the production of Androcles and the Lion from 1936. It's George Bernard Shaw, and Blanche's study for it. So because of these studies, which I discovered about 20 years ago, we know what the stage sets look like and the costumes. And they were so well known, this group, that when Androcles and the Lion premiered in Seattle, George Bernard Shaw sent them a congratulatory telegram. My last artist that we're going to talk about is Yvonne Twining-Humber, and Yvonne had a very unusual way of getting to Seattle as well. She starts out in New York City, and her mother was an opera singer with the Paris Grand Opera, and her father his last name was Twining. He was part of the Twining family. She always told me the poor side. Anyway, so he was a salesman from London, and so she was a surprise to her parents in 1907. So they came back to the U.S. so she could be born in the U.S. And this is one of her paintings this is a painting of the Pike Place Market done when she first moved here in 1945. Yvonne became a very close friend of me and my partner. She became like a grandmother to us. And she told me that she was on the WPA in Boston and New York City. And then when it ran out, she had to support her mother and her aunt. And they told her she had to get married because they needed money, right? So she needed to get married so, the man could support her. So this man from Seattle, he was a Jewish refugee who escaped the Nazis and came to Seattle and survived, luckily, but the rest of his family didn't. And so he was back east in the Berkshires area, Great Barrington, which is where Yvonne was originally from. And her mother and her aunt said, "Oh, we met a nice man, this Mr. Humber, and he owns a business and a house in Seattle, and you're going to marry him." And so she told me that 2 weeks later, she got married and to Mr. Humber and came out to Seattle where she didn't know anyone at all. And I had never met anyone in real life. I had heard of things like this. But I said, you met and married somebody you didn't know or love or anything? And she said, I had no choice at all. So she came out here in 1943, right after her marriage, and not knowing anyone. And a little later, her mother, the opera diva from Paris, joined her. And then right after the war, her mother-in-law was found, her husband's mother, who had survived a death camp and lost all of her family, all of her children, except for Yvonne's husband. So she was very sensitive to things like this. And in 1946, she got to know her husband. He was a classical pianist besides being a businessman. So he and her mother got along really well. And they ended up having a platonic love for each other. But this painting was purchased by Dr. Fuller at the Seattle Art Museum. It's called The Spoiled Carnival of 1946, and it depicts the Puyallup Fair right after it started up again, because the Puyallup Fair was used as a center for relocating Japanese Americans. So a lot of our Japanese American citizens here were sent to Puyallup to be processed, I guess, before they were sent to Minidoka and other, I think, concentration camps. And so this is a painting that she told me that started out as a lot of people having fun and enjoying the fair, and then when she found out that what had happened to, the Japanese people, especially some of the artists that she had known, she turned it into a storm. And so this is all sort of a cryptic comment that she made on that the history of that area was ruined for her, just the way the carnival was ruined by the bad weather. And there's a little photo she gave me of herself at the Seattle Art Museum when she had her first solo exhibition there, standing by the painting. She covered industrial subjects, very unusual for women at the time. This is a painting that I love and I own, actually. Now she gave it to me. A painting of a demolition scene. This was the original Frederick and Nelson's building down on 4th. And she went down there, sketched it, and then painted it. It's a very large painting. And again, this type of painting, if you know Mark Tobey and Morris Graves' work, this is sort of the antithesis of what they were doing at the time. And here she is winning an award for painting of the zoo down there. This painting's now lost. We haven't been able to locate it. And again, she was exhibiting with all of the major artists of the time. Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe. She knew some of the artists. Again, because she didn't receive the support here, and no one studied the early art scene here, she was completely swept under the rug until my partner and I moved here in 1986 and became friends with her, and I've been promoting her work ever since because she's extremely talented. And I'm going to end on these last two slides. There she is with the demolition painting that she gave me shortly before she died. She knew I loved it so much. And this was my very first show that I curated in 1990 at the Kirkland Arts Center. And I brought her along so she could see, so she could get some local recognition after many, many years. And when she got older, she worked with Artist Trust under me and my partner pushing her into doing something really nice for the community. And she set up the Twining Humber Award. So every year, Artist Trust gives a percentage, a $10,000 reward to a woman artist over 60 years of age that has dedicated her life to creating art, especially in the Northwest. And I just want to show you this because some of these, there is interest now around the country and around the world in women artists, and this is me showing you that I've been doing this for a very long time. So that is me. That's a portrait of me on the upper right, painted around 1990 by Yvonne Twining Humber. I sat for 2 portraits for her, and she was a smart but she was joking around with me. I used to spend every Monday with her, take her shopping, and she made the most horrible lunch you've ever tasted. She was a great painter, but a lousy cook. And so she made me sit for her, and I didn't want to do it, but I'm so glad I did now. And she's looking at me and, doing the painting, and she said, well, I might have to have you drive me to the art supply store. I said, why? I said, looks like you have plenty of paint. Well, I don't have enough of the flesh tone paint, she goes, and I don't know if I'll have enough to get your nose. So she was giving me a little little thing about my nose there. And this was the first exhibition that I rediscovered the Women Painters of Washington. This was in 1990, and that's Yvonne right there, sitting down. By that time, she couldn't walk. She had to use a walker. And that's me with the to her left. And that's Florence Nesbitt, who I mentioned before, was one of the founders of the Women Painters of Washington. And Dorothy Milne Rising, who was one of the founders of the Northwest Watercolor Society. She was 95 at the time. And that's my partner, Dominic. He's directly behind with the purple shirt. And that's a photo I love of me and Dorothy there in the lower left. And the card that I used for the first modern recognition of Women Painters of Washington back in 1990, which was their 60th anniversary. So that was a lot to take in. I'm very glad that you sat through it, and thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Okay. Any questions? Yes. Yeah, I just finished my 17th. Well, at our museum, hopefully, but you can get them anywhere the University of Washington books are sold. Yeah, it's that they distribute them, and it's international. They're distributed all over the world. In fact, I was going to mention, not only am I in our museum promoting art locally and nationally, I'm now an advisor to the Smithsonian, and I'm trying to get them to collect art from the Northwest. Because it's the American Art Museum with barely any art from the Northwest, so I'm trying to change that, and I've managed to get some works for them. And I'm doing a lecture at the Smithsonian in March. I've given 6 lectures in Europe. The last 2 in London sold out. And it was about our Northwest artists, but this last one in April was about our Japanese artists like George Tsudakawa, Paul Horiyuchi, and it sold out, and so did my one last year, and they asked me to come back again. And the audience were curators from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Tate They're very big things. So we're making a huge impact internationally by promoting Northwest art. So
Where is your gallery?
I don't have it anymore. I closed it because of the, I work for the museum strictly now as a curator and a writer, and I couldn't do both. I had
Cascadia, though?
Cascadia Art Museum is the museum that I curate for. It's right next to the Kingston Ferry. It used to be a Safeway store, but we converted it 10 years ago into a museum, and it is really nice.
And what I like is that you can park there. It's a
We have a
wonderful little
huge parking
trip
lot. Yeah.
to just drive up there and just park and get out and go in.
Yeah, and really
No
great
fuss.
restaurants too
Yeah.
that are there. Yeah, I can't say enough. I'm really, really lucky. When I gave a lecture in Berlin in 2013, it was a huge success. And it shocked me, of course. But because, to be upfront and honest with you, I've had a lot of other museums make fun of me from this time I started doing this, and saying, I was wasting my time, and that there was nobody else besides Toby and Graves in that group, that I was wasting my time. And I took it personally because I became friends with a lot of these artists, and I knew what some of them did. And it was like opening a nice Pandora's box, where the more I studied, I'm still discovering artists that were here. But a lot of them, they were almost all women that were forgotten, and yet they were the most famous, early on. The last thing I'll tell you too is in my promotion of Northwest art, because I made a lot of contacts in Europe by doing lectures. One of my friends that I became friends with that loves Northwest art now is the curator from the Louvre. The photography curator there. And so I've met people in very big places, and they love Northwest art. And I'm trying to work with them. We might be having our first international exchange exhibition next year, but I'm working on that. But for artists to be remembered, they have to be in collections. And so my partner and I we owned several collections, and we donated works. Remember Myra Wiggins? She was the first photographer I showed you, the one that was a friend of Stieglitz. We purchased her estate from her daughter about 30 years ago. And so we brought them in. Long story short, 12 of them are now in the collection of the d'Orsay Museum in Paris. And then we donated collections to the Pompidou Center as well. And we've been donating works all over the world to museums that will take them. When we visited last year the d'Orsay, which is my favorite museum in the world, I was really thrilled because I got to wear a badge that said visiting curator, and I still have it. And it was just really, really great. And the curator there, when I first met him, knew all about Myra Wiggins. If I went to any of the museums here in town and said, "Do you know who Myra Wiggins was?" they would say no. They wouldn't know. But this curator for this big major museum, and he was shocked that we were giving him these photographs. So we're promoting all over the world. I'm going back to do another lecture in London in April. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
It's available.
Oh, you can get them at our museum, at Cascadia Art Museum. Even the Seattle Art Museum sells some of them, but you can get them online, or any bookstore that sells, where the UW Press. Yeah. Yes.
These artists are all Northwest artists because they were doing work in the Northwest.
Yes.
Are there other things that distinguish Northwest artists from New England artists or Southern artists? Or
Yeah, I think I started to mention it. She was mentioning about what distinguishes them. The biggest thing, and I say this about the male and female artists from the Northwest, I've never seen art like this until I moved here because of the synthesis that you see. You see them being influenced by Native American culture. You see Mexican influences from Diego Rivera, from them going to study with them. You see, of course, Japanese and Chinese influences. So you have this sort of hybrid art that was produced here that shows all of these different types of influences. Of course, School of Paris too, but that's obvious. But you don't see that anywhere else in the country. And I think that's why people in Europe are responding to it, because it's so unique. If you want me to come back sometime and tell you about the Japanese artists, I'd be happy to. I love talking about them.
We'll take that up.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, we have one in the back.
Just one comment.
Sure.
I think you are to be commended highly for undertaking this subject, Northwest art, and certainly the women in it, none of which, or much of it, has not been known.
Yeah.
And we appreciate your coming
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you.
This is truly a revelation.
Oh,
and
thank
we
you.
commend you, and thank you so much
Oh,
for
you're
your
welcome.
time.
Yeah, I really love it myself. And I will share something personal with you. I'm gay, and when I was growing up, did somebody say yeah? Here. When I was growing up, I'm 70, and there was nothing for me to read about. I was very depressed and everything, and I had read horrible things about gay people when I was growing up and trying to learn about what was going on with me. And you know, almost everything that I saw I could relate to with the women and the Japanese artists. When I started uncovering it, all the lies, all of the misinformation, all of that in it, I thought, oh my God, this is what happened to me, you know. And so I related to it, and then I thought, I'm going to get even with these people. So part of my studies has been based out of being vengeful, to avenge them, basically, because I know what it was like to be an outsider. So that was my main motivation, besides the art being great. So, okay. Well, thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.